Hello, and welcome to the National Museum of the American Indians Professional Development Series, Giving Thanks, telling more complete narratives in your classroom. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bert Correa. I'm one of the assistant program coordinators in education at the museum. Giving Thanks, telling more complete narratives in your classroom is a free two-part webinar series designed for education professionals who teach about Native Americans during the month of November and beyond. In today's webinar, we'll focus on and examine the narrative around popular historical and contemporary images of Thanksgiving to inform us about how we came to think about the holiday. As with our in-person programs, we generally start with the land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge the Native people on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. For many Indigenous people, belonging is deeply tied to ancestral homelands through relationships with the environment, memories, cultural experiences that lasted over millennia. In the US, people are increasingly doing land acknowledgements which can be spoken or written and are meant to recognize the Indigenous people who are the original stewards of the lands on which we now live and work. These acknowledgements should be motivated by genuine respect for and support of Native people. Land acknowledgements are the first step in creating collaborative, accountable, and respectful relationships with the Indigenous nation and communities. Many of you may already do land acknowledgements in your classroom. For those of you who are looking for some guidance, the museum has developed a one-page handout, which will be placed in the chat and will also be sent out to each of the attendees after the webinar. The photograph you see is a contemporary picture of the Wampanoag from the museum's blog, another source of content and perspective that could be helpful in your classroom. As I mentioned earlier, I work at the National Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, a complex of museums, libraries, zoo, and research centers. We have two exhibition locations, one in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall, and the other one in New York City in Lower Manhattan. The Cultural Resources Center, seen on the far right, is where the stewards maintain our collections that are in our care. One of the most common questions we receive from teachers, students, and our general visitors is, why are we called the National Museum of the American Indian? The term American Indian is a general way to describe indigenous cultures and communities in the Western Hemisphere. There are nearly 600 federally recognized tribes in the United States, each with its own history, social political structure, cultural practices, and language. Since our museum represents Native people from the entire hemisphere, you can understand why a term like American Indian or Native American is sometimes inadequate to describe the vast diversity that exists amongst Indigenous communities today. Some people have preferences for a non-specific term. For the purposes of today's talk, we'll be using both terms, Native American and American Indian, when speaking generally about Indigenous people. We created a one-page handout entitled The Impact of Words, which we'll post in the link and send out after the webinar. It further describes tips for choosing appropriate language when speaking about Native Americans. Central to the museum's mission are strategic partnerships with Native people and allies. Collaborations with classrooms across the country is central to our collective efforts to teach students more complete narratives about Native Americans and advance our goal to foster a more informed understanding of Native people. We feel honored to do this work in education and with committed educators like yourself. The work of our National Education Initiative is at the heart of our work to make social justice rights become a reality. Native Knowledge 360, our museum's National Education Initiative, is our effort to highlight Native narratives, making more comprehensive histories and accurate information to enlighten and inform teaching and learning in K-12 classrooms. Native Knowledge 360 challenges common assumptions about Native peoples and offers a view that includes not only the past, but also the vibrancy of Native people and cultures today. At this time, I want to introduce my colleague, Renee, who is the Teacher Service Coordinator at the museum, where she designs and delivers curriculum and a variety of educational programs. She'll take it from here.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. As Bert said, my name's Renee Goki, and I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe on my paternal side. I'm also a member of the Turtle Clan in my community. On my mother's side, I'm Ukrainian and English. So let's talk a little bit about our plan today. We have our program objectives here, and in this webinar, we'll examine a few popular primary and secondary sources that have helped shape narratives around the story of the first Thanksgiving. We'll identify how different representations contribute to false narratives. And finally, we'll reflect on the education implications of those false ideas. And I'll share with you just a few strategies and approaches that may help support you in your classroom. The topic of Thanksgiving is for many young people or those new to this country, their first introduction to Native Americans that people might receive. The topic of Thanksgiving comes up early in the classroom and often. It's an annual national holiday, both in the United States and in Canada. And today we're going to structure this discussion through a cycle of questioning that begins with looking at popular imagery or narratives and asking questions about what we really know, why these issues and questions might be problematic, and how we might work to correct some of these. So let's hear from you. Please use your chat and tell me, when was the first time you learned about Thanksgiving? Who taught you, and what did you learn? So we'll take just a moment. I'm seeing kindergarten or first grade, art school, family, elementary, so many. School, I'm hearing a lot of school. That's right, probably kindergarten. Sometimes there were plays I'm seeing, and dress up, and later in high school and TV. That's right. Thank you so much for sharing. Your answers really help provide a grounding in what we think we know about Thanksgiving, because it's difficult. This topic is difficult because it asks some of us to unlearn what many of us have grown up with since an early age. Much of what we learn as a society about Native people begins at an early age, whether in school, as you mentioned, on TV, or at home and with your family. As children, and even for adults, these ideas that are formulated about American Indians can get mixed up. And it's hard to differentiate sometimes between what we watch on TV, what we learn in school, through children's books, or in popular culture, especially when we see so many images that show generic types of imagery and people don't have the opportunity to interact with Native people themselves. Here you see a Snoopy cartoon that's currently on exhibition and on view in our DC exhibition, Americans, which is also online. This exhibition explores the pervasiveness of Indian imagery that surrounds us both daily and throughout our lives. My colleague Vilma will add this link to the exhibition in the chat as well. So let's take an image of this, a look at this image by Charles Schulz of Snoopy and Woodstock celebrating Thanksgiving. This type of image is very common during Thanksgiving and throughout the year. With any source that we present to our children in classrooms, we want to learn as much as we can about it and ask questions about the author or illustrator. You might ask them about the date or the point of view, which are all great strategies. But for tonight's purposes, we're going to get right to a question that helps us look carefully at it and examine what it means. So what is the one element in this image, or what is one element that makes it identifiable as representing a Native American? Tell us in the chat. I'm seeing feathers and headdress. Yes, corn, costumes, war bonnet. Absolutely, popcorn. These are all absolutely right. And so this, this is a cartoon. So in this image, the headdress is a signifier of Indianness in this image. Why would Charles Schulz, put a headdress on Woodstock? Well, often when we see representations of Native people, they're shown wearing this type of headdress. While many Native nations have feather headdresses, one like this in particular, it's worn by men of the Northern Plains usually. Here you see a picture of a feather headdress that's a, well-known. Catlin is the artist, and, we see this type of image very commonly. It's typically made from eagle feathers, and it would be earned by the wearer for his valor and for his bravery, for maybe generosity or other characteristics that are deemed worthy by the community themselves. Yet when people think of or represent American Indians, they often depict them wearing this type of headdress. What we don't often see is women and children in a diversity of Native cultures. Many people represent generic versions of American Indians during Thanksgiving because it's supposed to reference a gathering that took place in 1621 between the misnamed Pilgrims and the misnamed Indians. So really it's, separatist and the Wampanoag, who are based in Massachusetts. The Wampanoag do not have a tradition of wearing this style of headdress, and it comes from thousands of miles from the Wampanoag homeland. And here you see a picture of the Wampanoag homeland, which is in Massachusetts, eastern Massachusetts, and southeast Rhode Island you see here, modern day states. So this is all Wampanoag homelands today. What is the educational impact of stereotypes? Well, there are many. The use of stereotypical imagery erases the diversity of Native cultures. We number about 577 federally recognized tribes today. And stereotypes trivialize the people and event by showing cartoonish versions of both the Indians and the Pilgrims. For our purposes today, this type of image can be hurtful to Native students because they serve to undermine the ability of American Indian nations and our allies to portray accurate and respectful images. And what you see here, you see a picture of a young girl in her regalia. So she's probably dressed for a powwow. And then you see everyday clothing, a picture of my children there as well. And these types of things may lead to misunderstandings between groups of people if we don't get more accurate portrayals of Native people. We can take the next slide. I should have mentioned too that, and you'll see in the chat that there's a helpful handout that we've created. That's a one-pager that will help you in your classroom, give you some terminology and some strategies and some context to why we don't call these clothes, this regalia, costumes, and give you some ideas of what you might do instead. And sometimes what we find is that teachers may not dress up or things like that in their classroom, but instead they need a tool or a one-pager to give to their colleagues who may really be holding on to some of these ideas. So Vilma shared that in the chat. Thank you, Vilma. So this is our essential understanding framework. And this provides tools and strategies to help you in your classroom. It follows the 10 themes of the National Council for Social Studies. For example, one of the themes in the National Council of Social Studies is culture. And what the museum did is we worked on some key concepts that could give you both terminology and frame your thinking in this booklet. And so they're following the 10 themes. And this is another tool that you have there in the chat that you can use to frame your thinking in your classroom. All right, we can move on to the next slide. So thank you. So what we're going to do now is we are going to work as a group. And I'd like you to take a minute if you want to grab, if you're low tech and you want to grab a piece of paper, that's fine. If you want to open a tab on your computer, but I'd like to just take about 60 seconds here and jot down what you know about Thanksgiving. So, early on, we talked about what you first learned, but surely now you're teaching in the classroom, you may have read articles or books, talked with colleagues, you have your own personal understanding, as we all do, about what Thanksgiving means to us. But let's just think about the event itself. What do we now know about Thanksgiving? So please go ahead and jot that down. I wanted to mention, while you're doing that that we're not going to end up doing a breakout room after all. We wanted to accommodate more teachers. So thank you so much for your grace. And we know that you do this every day in the classroom, constantly adjusting and being flexible. So thank you so much for your graciousness with that. And so we're going to do this as a team instead, as a whole team, as a whole group. So use whatever tool is best for you. Jot down what you know about Thanksgiving. We also have a worksheet that will pull up in just a minute if you'd like, so you can grab that. And what we'll be doing today is we're going to read the Edward Winslow letter, which is the only surviving eyewitness written account of the actual event by Edward Winslow, as I mentioned, from December 11th, 1621. So after you've jotted a few things down about what you know about Thanksgiving now, I'm going to just kind of quietly, just be here quietly for a moment and allow you to read this Old English. We know that we apologize, that's a little hard to get through. There is a transcribed version for students put out by Plymouth Plantation. So that might be another strategy for you. I won't be reading the Edward Winslow letter aloud. We'll have you read that. And we have some questions for you on the worksheet. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the worksheet here I have on the side. All right, so let's start to use the chat. And how we're going to do this, we're going to scaffold this more for me than for you today because there's only one of me. So let's think about what facts can we actually get from this letter. For example, can I get the elementary teachers that are joining us tonight to just simply answer the question from the letter, how many Native people were actually at the event? We see 90. Yeah. So, you know, and I don't know about you, but I feel like when I hear numbers and I see that, it kind of helps me visualize more accurately how many Native people were there. Okay, and then how about for our middle school teachers? What foods were there? What were people eating? Let's move to our middle school teachers. Shellfish, deer, corn, and fowl. Yeah, deer. Venison, Yeah. So I think they ate pretty well. No pumpkin pie, that's right. We don't get that from the letter, but we do know there probably wasn't pumpkin pie. Although my hunch is, I bet there was pumpkin. I know my community, you know, we smoked rings of, cut into rings pumpkin and smoked it. And we still have a pumpkin dance. So I bet you there may have been pumpkin there, but no pie. Yeah, that's great. And I think they ate well. I mean, we don't know for sure, but they could have eaten things like lobster and mussels and clams, right? I mean, look at the beautiful environment where the Wampanoag people are from. All right, for our high school teachers, what did they actually do? And how long did this event last? 3 days? Yes, Erin. No problem. We're glad everybody's here. 3 days with some sport, almost a week. Yeah, entertained and feasted for 3 days. Yeah, we did hear about entertainment. I think, was it recreation? Yeah. That's great. Okay, so now let's go back to however you jotted down your ideas about what you know about Thanksgiving and start to think for a minute and compare the differences between, and maybe some similarities between this letter from Edward Winslow, who was actually there, and your prior knowledge, your list that you made of the first Thanksgiving and what we know about that 1621 event? You know, this is a good question. How many pilgrims were there? I know, I believe it was 101 who came on the Mayflower, and they had lost about half. So I think 52 separatists or pilgrims were actually, you know, left when this event happened. I'm not sure how many actually attended the event, but that's a good question. Yeah, hope that helps. Yeah, there's a question about exercised our arms and were women and children there? So these are good wonderings and questions. And again, it can be a little bit hard to access this language. It's a little, you know, it's Old English. And we will get everyone a transcribed, it's on Plymouth Plantation, so it's pretty accessible. So again, does anybody want to add to, and they shot muskets? I had to unlearn and relearn a lot. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for mentioning that. I remember in my social justice education master's program, we talked a lot about having to unlearn what we think we know. Definitely perceive the event as being contained to a day and not stretching over time. Remembered as a celebration of the harvest. Natives were not invited. They probably didn't give the Wampanoag muskets. So it sounds like there's a lot. They don't call it Thanksgiving, that's right. Yeah, how they communicated. Those are good questions. I mean, Tisquantum had learned English, and so he was able to translate, and actually there was a diplomatic event that was going on before, so there was an actual treaty before this. So these are all really, really good questions. A lot of great wonderings there. Thank you. Thanks for participating in this activity. I really appreciate everybody's comments and their thinking. We know that time sharing with each other and thinking about your own classroom is really important. And this letter, while valuable as an eyewitness account, it's only one perspective. You know, it lacks any Native or women's perspectives, and it tells us a lot about how we value information and the written word. It may reflect some biases, of course, we all have biases, and depending on the relationship between Edward Winslow and the Wampanoag, we may get a very different view. So there's a lot of wonderings there. That's good. So here you see a wampum belt. And Native histories were maintained through oral traditions and mnemonic devices, such as a wampum belt, which you see here. Wampum belts served as agreements and were early forms of treaties between nations. And also they recorded important events in history. In addition, sometimes people still carry wampum to speak clearly and with clarity and for strength. This wampum belt uses imagery rather than words. And this particular belt is from the Great Lakes region from the 1800s. It may be Wyandot, from the Wyandot people. This reinforces the idea that Native people did record their history and important events from their own perspective. This particular belt, if you look at it closely, it shows a meeting between two cultures. Native people on the left and settlers on the right. You see at least one settler with a hat. And you also see on the left, the Native homes of the time, and on the right, the settlers' homes on the time. My colleague will add in the chat an educator's guide that teaches more about wampum and the Haudenosaunee. The focus on written accounts and documents over other forms of communication has tremendous implications on how history has been shaped and remembered. Much of what historians know regarding life in and around the region of the Wampanoags during the 1600s has come from Native oral traditions, from English letters and documents, and from material culture. Next, let's take a closer look at a painting many of you may be quite familiar with as a whole group. So let's start by looking carefully at this painting from J.L. Ferris. We're going to use a visual thinking strategy and take 60 seconds to carefully observe the painting and notice details. You're welcome to informally use the chat or just use your eyes to notice. Now, because there's so many of us here today, I'm going to modify this just a little bit and have you choose to look at a particular aspect of the painting. So I'm going to ask my elementary teachers if you could focus your attention on the people in the painting. Middle school teachers, please focus on the environment or the background. And that might extend to the ground itself. And finally, high school teachers, please focus on the actions between people. Okay. So what's going on in this picture? I see a woman front and center. Yes, yeah, my attention is also drawn to the woman. We see there's some mention of the clothing, the buckles and hats, and we know the pilgrims tended, they aren't really portrayed accurately. Definitely the native people are not portrayed accurately. There's people gathered. The pilgrims are offering food. That's right, to the native people. There may be a kind of a blanket someone's saying, and it kind of looks, is it southwest? We're not sure. The native people are sitting on the ground. And yeah, it seems like they're being served. What do you see that makes you say that? So if you're saying, that they're being served, what are you seeing that makes you say that? The settlers are at the table. It almost looks like the settlers are welcoming natives to their land. That's really an interesting observation. Okay, pilgrims seem comfortable in the environment. Yeah. Both groups have weapons, we hear. Yeah, and one of the things that, I recommend doing with your students, and you may choose to scaffold this in different ways, and we're actually going to hear from a teacher advisor in just a moment. But, really having kids think about when they make a statement about something they're observing, really have them say, what do you see that makes you say that? And provide evidence from their close looking. So I want to thank you all for doing that. I really like this strategy because it helps us all to kind of slow down for a moment and look carefully. And this visual thinking strategy encourages active processing of information and helps make everyone's thinking more visible. So I think it's a great way to build equity in the classroom as well. Well, this painting is one of 12 paintings by Jean-Léon Jerome Ferris, who is an American painter, although his name sounds French, that shows iconic events in American history. So he took 12 events in American history and portrayed them in paintings. You can learn more about the actual event and some of the context surrounding the event in the Harvest Myth resource, which we'll share in the chat, and which is a great resource for your classroom and for your own reading. Next, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague and friend, one of our teacher advisors from Maryland, Abir, who will share some modifications or approaches that you might want to adapt for your students. And I should mention while she joins us, that we'll have, you're welcome, thank you. We'll have some of her worksheets that she's put together in the chat as well. Abir?
First of all, I want to talk about, please ignore my background. Like I was saying, we're getting stuff done in the house, so I'm like stuck in a room. So I'm waiting for materials. So I taught middle school for forever for my career, and students love using images and paintings, and it's also a great way to engage students and get their point of view. So if you click on the Padlet, you will be able to, I added on the Padlet some activities that you can use with your students, and it's, taking some time. So the one that I would like to discuss, if you go to the Padlet, is called the Magic Eye, and we can discuss that one. So the cool thing about the Magic Eye is what you can do is similar to what Renee did, is you can use it for quadrants. And if what I included in that file, as it comes up and I can talk you through it, is at the end, there's an actual eye that you can cut out, laminate, cut out the middle part, and have kids, almost like a Ouija board, if you want to say, going over the image. And as they go over the image, they would fill out that worksheet of things that they noticed. And as you see how when Renee broke it down, when you're very specific about what you're looking for, it will help you really focus more on the intensity of the image or the painting that you're doing. I think people are saying they're having trouble. When I click on it, I get a message. Yeah, you need to download it because it is, you'll have to download it. Yep, it lets you download it. So if you download it, then you'll be able to get a Word document and it will show you the actual document. So when you use the Magic Eye, like I said, you can have the kids use it in quadrants. And then, you know, you want them to look at pieces of it and, you know, people, things, and activities. And sometimes we look at people and things. We don't talk about the activities. What are people doing? Does it look like it's something that is, you know, do they look like they're being friendly, or does it look like there's some animosity as well? And then you can dig deeper with those two questions. What does the image tell you about the way people lived? And what questions about these people would you also ask? So you can use that image to really have kids dig deeper into what is going on. But what we also want students to understand is to keep in idea of context. When was the painting created? I think this was 1912 for this one. And then you want kids to also ask those questions as to, okay, after you've seen all of this, what can you infer about the date that it was made? And also going back to what people have learned and what is something new that you may have learned from this painting as well. So that is for the Magic Eye. The other one is also called Point of View. And point of view is also something that we always want our students to understand, to discuss as well, because it's always good to get a different perspective. And there's more than one step for this one. As you can see, this one's a little bit more straightforward. You know, questions like, what do you think probably took place before this image was painting? Again, going to the contextualization of the image. And what was the artist's motive? Why do you think the artist created this image in this way? As opposed to, like one person said, it looked like the lady was serving the Native American. What do you think was the intent for the artist to create it that way? Why was there only one child? Or why do we have, you know, a person who's a soldier here and then there? So it really gives kids a better understanding of what's going on with that image as well, with the point of view. And then they want you have the students try to understand, now this isn't role playing. Now it's a big thing right now with social studies. We don't want to do role playing, but we want kids to learn about other people using point of view, because that also develops empathy. That also develops a better understanding of how people have lived their lives. So like for step 2, think about the subject's point of view. What do you think the subject of this image or photograph or whatever the students are looking at thought before, during, or after this painting was taken? And of course, if this is a painting that wasn't staged, have the kids kind of use their imagination. If there were real people who were there, or when they were doing it, what do you think they were thinking? You know, what was their idea? What was going through their head when they were having this being painted of themselves? And if there are at least 2 people in the photograph, what do you think they might have said to each other? You know, this seems like a nice, you know, meeting of people. What do you think they're saying to each other? How are they communicating if they aren't speaking also the same language? And that can also help students themselves understand, nowadays, how do we communicate if we don't speak the same language as well? Do you think their language or what they were talking about differed then than it did now as well? I'll answer that question about the role playing. Yeah, I see that question about the role playing. Let me finish the activity. I'll definitely go back to the idea of the role playing. And then finally, you can have the speech bubbles. And then kids, this could be like a nice assessment for students is, you know, after you've given them some contextualization, a little bit of a history of the painting, and they've dissected it, they can have that dialogue or some thought bubbles. And that way you can assess what they've learned. And also it could be used as maybe some questions that students may have. So that develops a richer understanding of a painting, and also kind of using it as a way to understand what happened then, but also keeping in mind that it's important to understand when something was painted and who was painted by for that point of view as well, because that's very important. So those are the two activities that we have on that Padlet. That Padlet is, you know, that link is open, so you can use it. All you have to do is download it. I also put the reading and that painting. And thank you. I'm glad that somebody really enjoys the handout. So if I can, Renee, answer the question about the role playing, if that's okay. So when we say role playing, what has happened in the past and what we want to really make sure we don't do is when we have students put in almost like a power structure. And almost, for example, there were a lot in the past, a lot of people would do the role playing of enslaved people. Okay, we want you to fit in this particular circle so we can fit in as many people so you knew what it was like on a slave ship or on a slave auction. Or for this case, you know, what ends up happening sometimes is teachers, you know, and their intentions are good, but what ends up happening isn't always good, where you have, you know, the teacher may point out just brown kids doing certain things where the power structure is very different. And that causes a lot of animosity in the classroom. So you want to be very careful that we don't recreate scenarios where there is that power dynamic among students in the classroom, because then you're also kind of objectifying your students of color, where again, your intent was in the right place and you may thought it was a good learning experience, but it really is not. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about role playing. Now, there are other concepts of role playing, but when we're talking about especially people of color or histories, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that a lot of the history, unfortunately, was a power dynamic. And we don't want to create that power dynamic as well. So it's good to have the dialogue, but at the same token, it's also good to make sure that you have your students in mind and also what you're doing with them so you don't create that sort of animosity in the classroom. So those were the activities that I thought would be great. You can modify them. I'm from a middle school background, but if you're in high school, you know, students in high school as well would love these activities. And if you have any other questions, just let me know.
Abir, thank you so much for those ideas. And you know, I think teachers were sharing some ideas that they have and some strategies that they might use in their own classroom. So these are things to kind of consider, think about your students and really what works for them, your comfort level with the content and context, but, you know, hopefully some of these primary sources could be of service to you. So thank you again, Abir, that's really great. And I wanted to say that, you know, the mention of role playing, this is something that comes up. And so, you know, I think the museum look forward to it in the future, but I think, you know, one page or a helpful handout on something like this may be really supportive for you. So I think that we'll go ahead and do that. All right, so let's think back to the letter and what we know actually happened and the painting from about 1810, circa 1810, which means 10 years on either side. Upon reading the letter from Winslow and coupling that with the painting, we find that a critical voice is missing, and that, of course, is the Wampanoag. In fact, there's no record about the Native people who participated in this exchange, nor their understanding of the day from that time period. However, we do know that the Wampanoag lived on, they thrived, and they understand deeply the land in which they come from, in which they stewarded for thousands of years. And importantly, they're still here today. Notice these food objects that show the longevity of Wampanoag people in Massachusetts, modern day Massachusetts, and Southeast Rhode Island. You see a picture on the left of a corn pounder, and this was really familiar to me as well as Bert, actually. In our Shawnee community, these were used historically. Many of them now are in museum collections for our Shawnee bread dance. So we have a fall and a spring bread dance where we make hundreds of cakes of corn. Now today, Shawnee people being modern and the women living in the modern world, they use splinters today for some of the corn to make those 300 corn cakes. On the right, you see a lobster net, and this shows the rich diet of the Wampanoag people. At the event between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, people more likely ate corn and shellfish, as we all talked about earlier, than turkey, and certainly not potatoes, which hadn't yet come up from South America by that point. A great tool to bring Wampanoag voices into your class in accessible ways is through just these two books. There are others, but we wanted to feature these two. So Wampanoag means people of the first light, or people of the dawn. I've been told that as well. So you see these two books that are great resources, children's books and the storytelling narrative, and using books by Native authors. So we have some recommendations there for you. All right, so here we see another source of information. We see our blog here, a picture of our blog. So Native people around the country have hundreds of different ways of approaching the idea of giving thanks. And I will say, I certainly can't speak for all Native people, but many Native people, it's a daily occurrence to greet the rising sun and to give thanks for all of the things that we have in our lives, the nipir, the water, the land. There are also community feasts, there are seasonal celebrations, there are giveaway ceremonies. So there's such a variety of ways that Native people give thanks. And this blog provides an opportunity to bring in additional perspectives on Thanksgiving that you could use in your own classroom. And it's important to know that not one person can represent all Native people. So a strategy I might recommend is to think about using these perspectives in the blog and others to talk about Thanksgiving as a daily event or what it means to them. And by the way, Velma has added into the chat that blog for you. And now we're going to finish up today, and there's some articles being exchanged. Great. There are so many great articles on Thanksgiving. So there's a lot of scholarship on this and more diverse perspectives being added. So thanks for that, Tiferet. Now we'll finish up by adding one more perspective on the holiday from NMEI's Comanche curator, Paul Chott-Smith. Feel free, if you'd like, to jot down an idea that stands out to you from either a personal perspective or from a teacher point of view, or maybe those two hats that you wear are sort of hard to separate. So go ahead and we'll turn to the video now.
All right. So, what is Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving is insane. It's this huge, incredible disaster on highways and airports, and it's crowded, and the weather's awful. A meal that takes days, sometimes weeks of preparation, emotional turmoil, fights. But the fact that it's a national holiday that really envelops everyone, it's a sense of the entire country in motion in a way that isn't really like any other day in American life. And the way it's corny, it's cartoonish and kitsch, is kind of a protective layer to sort of not get too direct about it. So underneath all those things, Thanksgiving is about trying to come to terms with this very difficult truth about the United States, that the country is a national project that came about at great expense to Native people. And it's not enough that we're a good country. We kind of have to be the best country, But Native people and African slavery, those two things together, are huge challenges to how you process this. So eventually the country ended up deciding, you know what, we like the story about that meal at Plymouth a long, long time ago, in which these newly arrived people from England in this new country had their brunch in the forest with Indians. And what was that saying? That was saying that we're neighborly. We want this to work out. And we know it didn't all work out, but that's what we aspire to be. That's sort of our best selves.
Did that meal actually happen?
It happened, but nobody really cared. It wasn't like, oh, remember that time last November, let's have those folks over again, fire up the grill. Nobody thought that because it was just a thing that happened. But the Pilgrim folks there, they were writing letters or writing journals. They were like really meticulously detailing what was happening. But even that written account gets lost for basically 200 years and doesn't even emerge until the 1840s when this document is discovered again. And even then, it's not a big deal. It's actually in a footnote. And we remember that, we rescue it from being a footnote because that has meaning now. And so by the early 20th century, Indians are an indivisible part of what creates the United States. It's not a chapter that happened and it was bad and we got over it. We're in your head, we're in your pantry, we're in your garage. This imagery, representations, advertising, Thanksgiving says, however imperfectly we remember Indians, we're remembering Indians. And with all the problems with it, it's still a powerful idea, and it's still powerful to not Photoshop Indians out of the national narrative, to say, we're owning this. If there's a way that can open up ways to start thinking about it differently, opens up for people to become activists and try to change things, invent some new kind of Thanksgiving. Let's have the discussion. Let's see where that goes. But before you get to the lessons, I mean, is it right to use that? Is it whatever? I don't know. I guess if I were to put myself in terms of, this a cartoon Indian and all this at Thanksgiving, I'd probably be saying I'm glad to be here. Better than the alternative.
So there were some interesting chat going on, I noticed during the film, and some resource sharing, which is great between teachers. Really appreciate that. There were some powerful things for me that I heard. This idea of the entire country, and there's sort of some inclusivity around the holiday that I feel, at least. And there's also this hard truth about this idea that the country came at great expense to Native people and to slaves. So it's a story, that's aspirational and asks us to be our best selves. Although this is imperfect, it's still a powerful idea, as Paul says. And I would argue from an educator perspective that by telling a more truthful history about the event, about the 3-day event and that story, and giving context to what happened before and about Tisquantum and all of the different people and this meeting between two cultures, it actually becomes a more remarkable story, not less. So with that, I want to just turn it back to you, teachers, and have you use the chat to think a little bit about how today's workshop, and maybe you can just select one, how is it either shaped, changed, or challenged how you plan to teach about Thanksgiving in your classroom? And if you already feel pretty comfortable, feel free to put that in the chat too. Some ideas that you have that are working for you. I'm seeing strategies for the youngest children to start with the truth. That's right. Yeah, our kids can handle the truth. Strive for accuracy. That's great. Yes. Again, there's a lot of research and there's a lot of information out there. Incorporate more accurate visuals. Yes, to counteract, some of the other things that we've seen. Change my perspective. Gave me ideas to help students see diverse perspectives. I feel energized. True delivery of the event. Yeah, teach the content. That's one of the things I kind of struggled with, is how much content do we fit in, using critical thinking skills so they can research on their own. That's right. And so this is a call to action for some of you too. We didn't give a lot of content. What strategies can you use? What other questions do you have? Yeah, you've got more confidence, switching the lens. working on breaking down mascots. That's great. Focus on what we should do. I love that. Focus on what we do know, right? Shift from the dominant narrative. A lot more to learn about Native American history. That's right. We all do. I mean, there's so much to know, right? Diverse cultures. And I saw the book, Indigenous Peoples History and Indigenous Peoples History. Great book. There's a young adult version. Be careful about heroes and holidays. That's right. Like, let's teach beyond the month of November, right? Let's teach beyond Thanksgiving. Let's integrate this because we think Native American history is American history. Great ideas. Thank you, everyone, so much. That's fantastic. All right. So I think what we're going to do, this concludes my piece. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Bert. Thanks, everyone.
Growing up in New York City, as a young Taino person, for those who don't know, the Taino are the descendant of the indigenous people of the Caribbean. I participated in an educational program which focused on Native education. I had the opportunity to visit Wampanoag communities. This left a lasting impression on me, definitely contributed to my cognitive development and allowed me to connect with other Native people. So I'm thankful and very happy to conclude this lesson with a focus on the Wampanoag today. As we talked about earlier in this presentation, most textbooks and curricula today still present Native Americans in the past. Few stories feature 21st century Native lives. Too many young students are not aware that descendants of the people who engaged with the separatists in the early 17th century continue to call New England home. We wanted the students to see the faces of people with whom we focused on, including young Native children today. We also are mindful that perception plays a large role in how students think about and understand Native history and culture. Seeing people in everyday clothing, engaging in cultural activities, and speaking in relatable languages enables students to change their perceptions of Native people as not only living in the past, always wearing regalia, or whatever prevailing notions that they may have. Part of the work we do at the museum is helping teachers hear from and ultimately appreciate Native voices, cultural values, those that have been silenced for too long, creating opportunities for dialogue and raising awareness of our complex histories, contemporary realities, and bringing to light our shared history can't happen without you. We recognize that your role as leaders in the classroom and with children, with parents, and with your colleagues is critical to the healing and reconciliation in this country. I believe that the role of education is not only to learn about history, science, and math, but to recognize that multitudes of ways of seeing the world exist, inspiring a love of learning and finding better ways to live together equitably. It is our work in progress that comes daily, both from small acts and larger coordinated efforts. We are truly grateful for the work you do each and every day to inspire and to teach our next generation. Here are some pictures of contemporary Wampanoag, showing some Native people as present-day members of communities that continue to strive to keep their cultures alive, vibrant. This helps the work we do to advance our work. We thank you for joining our program today, and I hope you can join us next week. We have a presentation with Marissa Corin, where we discuss the Three Sisters, its connection to Thanksgiving address, and how it's practiced by Haudenosaunee people today. We'll also post a link in the chat to where you can learn about the National Museum of American Indians Native Knowledge 360 initiative. This initiative provides educators and students with new perspective on Native American history and culture. On this website, you can find online classroom lessons, guidance student programs, and other teacher training opportunities like this one. As a reminder, we will include all links to all the resources mentioned in today's webinar in an email to attendees afterwards. This email will also have a link to a survey where you can share your thoughts and feedback about this presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Have a good night.